Ay, 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 la, la, da, ay, da, 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 da. Ay, ay, la, lam, bum, bum, ba-dum, bum. Ay, 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 na, 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 da. Yanda da 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 la 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 ay ay da 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 yay. What's up, everybody? A good vok, shavua tov, a good week. Great to be starting the week right, learning with you on a Saturday night. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house on a Saturday night? Karen in Northern California, Melissa in Great Neck, New York, Joe in the Inland Empire, Paula in Chicago, Bella in Florida, Carla in Brazil. Paula's taking notes in the house. Paula, sing along with Sal. You guys are the best. Marjorie says shalom. Ella says shalom. Aoife in Florida. Marie in Freeport, New York. And as always, I am profoundly impressed with the people who are doing this past midnight on the East Coast. Wow. Yasher Koach. May you be strengthened to be such diligent learners for your whole lives to 120 years of age. We say amen. Our daf today, Ayin Zion, page 77. Here in Tractate Gittin. With God's help, we're going to complete our discussion of Mishnah number 8, and with it, chapter 7, and we'll move into chapter 8. Mishnah number 8 held, if a husband gives a wife saying that this is your bill of divorce, if I do not come back from now until the end of 12 months, and he died within the 12 months, this is not a valid bill of divorce. It can't be made retroactively effective because he didn't use the correct language. He would have needed to say, this is your bill of divorce from now, right? The bill of divorce is effective now. If he says this becomes your bill of divorce if I die, no good, because it only becomes effective after his death, and at the moment of his death, his wife became a widow. She can't then become a divorcee. But if you say this is your get from now, right, we're divorced as of now, but only if the condition is fulfilled later, that he doesn't come back in 12 months, including if he dies during that 12 months, etc. The condition can be fulfilled later, but becomes effective as of the moment that he gave her the get. That's what the Mishnah says. And then the Mishnah also talks about if one doesn't give her the get from now, but says to somebody who becomes his agent, write and give a bill of give a get to my wife if I do not return after 12 months. And it discusses, well, so according to that, if he doesn't come after 12 months, then the agent is authorized to write up a get and give it to the wife. What if they wrote the get, or what if they wrote and gave the get before he returned? Not valid. Okay, so we picked this up at the very bottom of page 76b. Abaye said, everyone concedes that in the case where the husband said to his wife that the get will take effect once the sun emerges from its sheath, meaning in the morning when the sun comes up, he is saying to her that it will be valid once the sun comes out in the morning. And if the if the husband dies during the night before sunrise, then this will be a get after his death, and therefore it is invalid, right? He says, this is your get, right? If he says this get will take effect when the sun comes up. Okay, that works. He can say that, and then the next morning when the sun comes up, that's her get, and they are divorced. But if he dies before that moment, then even though he gave it to her while he's alive, he said it only becomes effective when the sun comes up, and he died before that, so she became a widow before the divorce took effect. But if he said to her, and now we're on 77a, on the condition that the sun will emerge from its sheath, right? This is your get on the condition that the sun will come up in the morning. So then he is saying to his wife that the get will take effect retroactively from now once the son emerges. And as Rav Huna says, that Rav says, anyone who states a condition employing the actual language where he says on the condition that, as opposed to if. He doesn't just say if. He says on the condition, right? This is your get on the condition that the sun will rise in the morning. Then this is as if he said from now. So if he says this is your get on the condition that the sun will rise in the morning, then even if he dies before the sun comes up, when the sun comes up, the get becomes effective, and it was effective from the moment that he gave it to her, and so she was divorced before she became widowed. The Tanaim disagreed only in the case of one who said to his wife, this will be your get if the sun emerges from its sheath. Not on the condition that, but which is a more formal language which implies this is your get from now. Like saying on the condition that is like saying this is your get from now if the sun will rise tomorrow. So what if he says this is your get if the sun will rise tomorrow? He didn't say the words on the condition that. He didn't say from now. So then what happens? So the Tanaim disagreed only in the case of one who said to his wife, this will be your bill of divorce if the sun emerges from its sheath and the husband died during the night. So one sage referred to as our rabbis in this discussion holds in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yosef, who says that if there's a date written in a document, this proves when it takes effect, and it's as if the person said from now, or from today if I die, or from now if I die. And the other sage, the unattributed Tana of our Mishnah, does not hold in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yosef, and it is as if the husband only said, this is your get if I die, in which case it's an invalid get, right? And that's actually the majority view. So if the guy said, this is your get if the sun comes up in the morning and he dies before that, no, she became a widow. He has to say on the condition that the sun will come up in the morning, or from now if the sun will come up in the morning. Now the Mishnah states that if a husband says to other people, right, he's going to make them his agent, and he says to others, write and give a bill of divorce. Write and give a get to my wife if I do not come back from now until the end of 12 months. And they wrote that get within the 12 months, but gave it to her after 12 months. This is not a valid get. And Rabbi Yosef disagrees and says it is a valid get. And the issue is, he said to these people, specifically, write and give a get to my wife if I do not come back from now until the end of 12 months. So, when is the condition fulfilled? When he doesn't come back at the end of 12 months. What are they supposed to do then? Write a get and give it to his wife. So if they wrote the get before the 12 months elapsed, then waited for he didn't show up, now we give it to her. No, because they didn't follow his instructions, and therefore that get is made null and void. Rav Yemar said to Rav Ashi, shall we say that Rabbi Yosef holds that in general, if he wrote a get on condition, then it is valid even if the condition was not fulfilled? And Rav Ashi replied, no. Actually, I could say to you that according to Rabbi Yosef, it is invalid if the condition is not fulfilled. And here, where Rabbi Yosef says, the husband said, write, if I do not come back within 12 months, write and give a get. And then they wrote it before the 12 months elapsed, right? The majority says that get is null and void. But Rabbi Yosef says that's okay. The fact that they wrote it before the 12 months is up is okay, as long as they only gave it to her after the husband didn't return after 12 months. So why did Rabbi Yosef say that? Since the husband could have said, if I do not come back within 12 months, write and give the bill of divorce to my wife, which would emphasize that they may write the document only if he does not come. But instead, the husband said, write and give a bill of divorce if I do not come back. This is what the husband is saying. Write the get from now and give it to my wife if I do not come back within 12 months. And what do the rabbis hold? The majority that disagrees with Rabbi Yosef, they hold that it is no different when the husband formulates his instructions like this, and it is no different when the husband formulates his instructions like that. The court cannot differentiate based on the minor differences in the formulation. he said pretty clearly, write and give if I do not come back. So if they wrote before the time period elapsed, they didn't follow his instructions, they made the get void. Now, since the Mishnah discussed conditions dependent on time, the Gemara cites a Baraisa on a similar topic. And the sages taught, if the husband said to his wife, this is your get if I do not come back after a 7-year sabbatical cycle, the word after means that the bill of divorce, the get, is not valid until a full year after the conclusion of the 7-year cycle. Interesting. It's like the 7-year cycle, it's like the year afterwards is still somehow part of it. And since you're counting in years, you have to add one more year before you're really out of that cycle. And if the husband said, this is your get if I do not come back after 1 year, well, then his get does not become valid until 1 month after the end of the year. And if he said, this is your get if I do not come back after 1 month, then it is not valid until 1 week after the end of the month. And the Gemara clarifies other similar cases not mentioned in the Baraisa. And if the husband said, this is your get if I do not come back after a week, then what is the law? And the Gemara answers, Rabbi Zera sat before Rabbi Asi, and some say that it was Rabbi Asi who sat before Rabbi Yochanan. And he said the following: Sunday and Monday and Tuesday are called after Shabbos. Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday are called prior to Shabbos. So it's just a little nuance there that actually extends beyond this area of the law. That until Tuesday, we're still connected to the previous Shabbos, and from Wednesday forward, we're connected to the next Shabbos. And it is taught in a Baraisa that Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, Rebbe, says, if a man says, this is your get if I do not come back after the pilgrimage festival, right, when the temple was standing and people would go to Jerusalem for the festival on Pesach, on Passover, on Shavuos, and on Sukkot. So he says, this is your bill of divorce. If I do not come back after the festival, then the document is valid only 30 days after the festival. He has to wait 30 days to give him a chance to get back. And Rabbi Chia went out and taught this law in public in the name of Rebbe, and they praised it. And he then taught in the name of the majority as an unattributed opinion, and they did not praise it. So apparently the law is not in accordance with this ruling. Consequently, the sages did not praise Rabbi Chia when he taught it as if it were a majority ruling, as that would cause it to be accepted as halacha, as law, as settled law. And that's the end of chapter 7. Now, they didn't really explain. They were just having, brought up the subject of gets that are time dependent. They just said, so, if the husband said, this is your get, if I do not come back after the sabbatical cycle, the 7-year cycle, then he gets an extra year to return, I guess because he's measuring in years. Is this to account for travel time? I don't know. The reasoning is unexplained, and so we move on. That was the end of chapter 7. Here comes chapter 8. Now, we've been talking so much in all these chapters about the language that the husband uses in writing the get, in delivering the get, in talking to his agents, conditional language, etc. What's been an assumption all along is that we know that the law is the husband gives the wife the get, and that's what triggers the divorce, right? And she has to receive the get. That has to happen in the presence of witnesses. We've talked about that. But what does it mean to give the get? What constitutes giving the get? Now we're going to start discussing that. So we begin chapter 8, Mishnah number 1, still on page 77a. In a case of one who throws a get to his wife and she is in her house or in her courtyard at that time, then she is divorced as though he placed the get in her hand. If he threw it to her in his house or in his courtyard, even if the get is with her in the bed, she is not divorced. If he threw the get into her lap or into her basket, then she is divorced, even if she was in her husband's house at the time. Okay, so clearly if he puts it in her hand, he gave her the get and she is divorced. If he puts it in her lap or he puts it in her basket, she is divorced. If he puts it in her courtyard, right, she refuses to take it. She doesn't want to get divorced. She refuses to receive it. So he just basically puts it at her feet. If this can be termed her courtyard, then she's divorced. But if she's in his courtyard, then not. So let's read why. Here's the Gemara. From where are these matters derived? What is the basis for the law that when the husband throws the get into his wife's house or courtyard, the divorce takes effect? And the Gemara answers, it is as the sages taught. The verse states, with regard to a bill of divorce, with regard to a get, quote, and gives it in her hand. That's Deuteronomy 24:1. From which I have derived that she is divorced. And let me just see something here. Yeah, Deuteronomy 24, verses 1 through 3. Let's just listen to that. When a man takes a wife and marries her, and it comes to pass, if she finds no favor in his eyes, because he has found some unseemly matter in her, and he writes her a scroll of severance, and he gives it in her hand, and sends her out of his house. And she departs out of his house, and goes and becomes another man's wife. And the latter husband hates her, and he writes her a bill of divorce, and gives it in her hand, and sends her out of his house. That's just the three verses that are going to be employed in deriving laws in this chapter. Okay, so as we just read, the verse states with regard to a bill to a get, and he gives it in her hand. And from this I have derived that she is divorced only if the husband places it in her hand. From where do I derive that she is divorced even if the husband places it on her roof, or in her courtyard, or in her enclosure? Well, the verse states, and gives it, indicating that she is divorced in any case, regardless of the manner in which he gives her the bill of divorce, as long as it constitutes giving. And that is also taught in a baraisa with regard to a thief. It is written, if the theft be found in his hand. That's Exodus 22, verse 3. From which I've derived that one is liable for theft only when the stolen item was found in his hand. But from where do I derive that one is liable for theft even if it was found on his roof, or in his courtyard, or in his enclosure? I.e., if the item reached his domain and he secured it with the intent to steal it. So the verse states, if the theft be found, indicating that he is liable in any case, whether it was found in his hand or in his domain, right? And that certainly makes sense to us. Now, we're not going to say that a thief is only going to be prosecuted if he's caught with the stolen property literally in his hand. Of course, it's enough that he removed it to his house or some other domain under his control for us to say he's a thief, he's caught, he has to pay the penalty of a thief. And so likewise, when we say that the husband gives a get into the hand of his wife, it's enough if he gives it into her domain. Now the Gemara comments, and it is necessary to teach this law in both cases, as if the Torah had taught us only with regard to a get, one could have said, because a husband divorces his wife against her will, he can, right? The husband has the power to divorce the wife. Because a husband divorces his wife even against her will, the divorce is effective regardless of how the husband places the document in her possession. But a thief who is not accountable for theft that he performs against his will, right? A thief who robs because he's forced to rob and it was literally, truly against his will, he's not held accountable for that. So say no, he is liable only when he actually steals the item with his hand and not when it enters his domain by other means. And if the Torah had taught us only with regard to a thief, one could have said, because the merciful one penalized the thief, obligating him to pay double the value of the item, it is clear that the Torah is strict with a thief. Similarly, the Torah also deemed him responsible for an item that was not actually in his hand. But with regard to a get, say no, the divorce is not effective unless the husband places the document in her hand. Therefore, it is necessary to teach the law in both cases. You can't learn the law of in your hand for the divorce from the case of the thief and vice versa, because there's other differences in the law, and that's why the Torah taught it in both cases. Now, it was taught in the Mishna that if the husband threw the get into the wife's courtyard, she is divorced. And the Gemara asks, how can she own a courtyard of her own? There is a principle. That which a woman acquired is acquired by her husband, which indicates that the husband has the rights to all profits generated by his wife's property. Right now, we've seen that a wife can bring property into a marriage, and then if they divorce or he dies, she takes her property with her. It becomes her property once again, entirely hers. However, while they're married, the husband has the rights to the produce. If she brings a field into the marriage, while they're married, the husband has the right to the produce of the field. Therefore, for all intents and purposes, the courtyard belongs to him for the duration of their marriage. You can't say it's entirely her courtyard if he has the right to any profit or produce generated by that piece of property. So Rabbi Lazar says the Mishna is referring to a case where the husband writes to his wife, I have no legal dealings or involvement in your property, thereby relinquishing any ownership rights to her property. So he by his own volition, he says, you know what, I relinquish any rights that I have in her property. That's her property, so now I can drop her get into it. And the Gemara asks, and when he writes this to her, what of it? But isn't it taught in a Baraisa? One who says to another, with whom he owns a field in partnership, I have no rights and claims to this field, or I have no involvement with it, or my hand is removed from it. It is as though he said nothing, since these expressions are not considered to be a withdrawal of his rights to the field. He can sell it, he can gift it, but he hasn't gifted it just by saying I have no rights in it. Now the Gemara answers, they say in the school of Rabbi Yanai, the case is one where the husband writes to her, and she is still only betrothed, right? So they were betrothed. Remember that if we have a betrothal, they're not yet married, but it does require a get to break off a betrothal. The difference between betrothal and full marriage is one of the differences is that the husband doesn't have the right to the betrothed man does not have the right to the produce of the woman's field until they're fully married. So it sounds like, okay, if they were only betrothed and she owns a courtyard, he could drop the get in her courtyard. It's fully her courtyard, so it's her domain, so this should work. And this is in accordance with the statement of Rav Kahana. As Rav Kahana says, with regard to an inheritance that comes to a person from another place, i.e. it is not an inheritance from his father, a person can stipulate about it from the outset that he should not inherit it. And this condition is effective in annulling his rights to the inheritance. Somebody doesn't have to accept an inheritance. And this teaches that as long as the property has not yet entered his possession, he can withdraw his rights to it. And this is in accordance with the statement of Rava. As Rava says, one who says, I do not want to avail myself of the ordinance of the sages that was instituted on my behalf, such as this scenario, we listen to him. 77b. And the Gemara asks, what is referred to by the words, such as in this scenario? So what case did Rava refer to that he indicated that in similar situations the law is the same? And the Gemara explains that Rava was referring to that which Rav Huna says that Rav says. As Rav Huna says that Rav says, a woman can say to her husband, I do not wish to be sustained by you, and I will not do work for you. Right? So in a traditional marriage, the husband has an obligation to sustain his wife, feed her, clothe her, shelter her, etc. And in return for that, he's entitled to the profit that she makes by work that she does. I mean, obviously in a proper marriage, it's a community effort, right? And whatever he earns and she earns, it goes into the community. And I don't mean like the legal term community property in California, but they're working together toward the same end of creating a home and family, etc. Now that we're talking in the realm of divorce, okay, so there could be a breakdown, and they might start to say, well, I want this, I want that, and you could see this. But one of the options that we've already seen that a wife has is maybe she's a bigger earner than him, and she doesn't want to share her earnings with her husband. So she says, you have an obligation to sustain me. I relinquish that right. You don't have to sustain me. You don't have to feed me. You don't have to clothe me. You don't have to shelter me. None of that. And in return for that, I'll live from my earnings, and you, my husband, do not have a right to my earnings. And she can do that. Where am I? Although the sage is instituted on her behalf, that she would be sustained in exchange for her work, because for the most part in the ancient world, husbands had a much bigger potential to bring in income to the family than the wife did. I mean, it was, very sexist societies, shall we say. and she didn't have as many opportunities to earn as he did. So the sage is instituted on her behalf, that the husband has the obligation to sustain his wife, and the small thing in return is that whatever little money she can bring in, becomes the property of the home, as it were. But she doesn't have to avail herself of that protection of the sages. She can relinquish that right. Now, Rava said that one can resolve the question about the wife's ability to acquire a get in a courtyard in a more direct way. Is that to say that her hand is not acquired by her husband? Yet despite the fact that he owns her hand, right, in the sense that legally a husband marries, when a husband marries a wife, he acquires her, right? So in a sense, he owns her, so he can put the get in her hand. But if he owns her, it's like he's putting the get in something that he owns. It's not hers. Her hand is not hers, right? But what Rav is now saying is when he puts the get in her hand, simultaneously, she's becoming divorced. Her hand is becoming entirely her own again. Her husband owns no part of her body, including her hand. So as he puts the get into her hand, she receives both the get and her hand back, and that's why she's able to receive the get in her own domain. Rav is going to make the argument that likewise, even though any property that she brought into the marriage, the husband has certain rights to it while they're married, when he puts that get in her courtyard, it's simultaneously that courtyard becomes entirely hers again and is able to receive the get because the divorce, the giving, the courtyard, everything happens simultaneously. See how Rava says it? Rather, one must say that her get and her hand, i.e. her complete ownership over her hand, enter her possession simultaneously. And since the get releases her from her obligations to her husband, at that moment, she acquires full rights to her hand. So here too, in the case of her courtyard, one can say that her get and her courtyard enter her possession simultaneously, as her husband's rights to her property are terminated at the time of the divorce. Ravina said to Rav Ashi, was it difficult for Rava to understand the law that one can effect a divorce by placing a get in the hand of a woman? Why is this difficult? Why do you need to say she needs to acquire her hand back at the moment of the divorce when the Torah itself says he puts the get in her hand? Though the rights to her earnings belong to her husband, does her hand itself belong to him? They're saying, no, obviously not. Therefore, since a woman owns her hand, she is divorced when she receives the get in her hand. It is not necessary to apply the principle that the get and her hand enter her possession simultaneously. Therefore, there is no proof that the get and her courtyard enter her possession simultaneously. You can't make the case that she receives her hand back. Her hand never left her possession. And if you can't make that analogy, as it were, then you can't use that as a proof to say that her courtyard returns to her possession simultaneously with receiving the get. And that doesn't serve as a proof to why he can drop the get in her courtyard. So Rava, the problem being that even though she owned the courtyard before the marriage, while they're married, the husband has rights in that courtyard. So maybe it's not really her domain, and you can't say that putting the get in her courtyard is fully in her domain. So he hasn't divorced her. Rav Ashi said to Ravina, it was difficult for Rava to understand the law that one can effect emancipation by placing a bill of manumission in the hand of a slave. Now, the hand of the slave is very different than the hand of a wife. A slave, and thank God we don't have slavery anymore. I mean, it exists in the world, but not under Jewish law. But in the ancient world, when slavery did exist, okay, so the master owned the slave. So now, how can you put the bill of manumission, right, the document that frees the slave, into the hand of the slave, right? The slave doesn't own his hand, and yet this is how you free a slave. So it's difficult for Rava to understand the law that one can effect emancipation by placing the bill of manumission in the hand of the slave, as follows. According to the one who says that a slave can be emancipated with a bill of manumission by receiving the bill himself, one can ask, how is this effective? Isn't the hand of a slave like the hand of his master, as the master owns the slave's body? Therefore, when the master gives the bill of manumission to his slave, it is as though he gave it to himself, and the bill is never considered as having reached the slave's domain. How can the slave be emancipated in this manner? Rather, one must say that his bill of manumission and his hand enter his possession simultaneously. So too, with regard to a woman's courtyard, one can explain that her bill of divorce and her courtyard enter her possession simultaneously. Now, the Gemara relates that there was a certain person on his deathbed who wrote a get for his wife toward the evening of the coming of Shabbos, so on Friday afternoon, late Friday afternoon. But he did not manage to give it to her. The next day, his condition intensified and he was unable to give her the get. People came before Rava to ask what they should do. He said to them, "Go tell the man to transfer to her ownership." Rava said to the people, "Go tell the man, the dying man, to transfer to his wife ownership of that place where the get is resting. And she should go and close the door and open it and assert ownership over it, thereby acquiring the place together with the get that is in it." And as we learned in a Mishna, Bava Basra 42a, if one locked, fenced in, or breached any amount, this is a valid act of taking possession of real property through which land is acquired. So Rav Ilish said to Rava, "How will it help for her to acquire the place, since that which a woman acquired is acquired by her husband?" And Rava was embarrassed that he had issued an incorrect ruling. Ultimately, it was revealed that she was a betrothed woman, not a married woman. Rava said, "I ruled correctly, as even if they said with regard to a married woman that everything she acquires belongs to her husband, would they say the same with regard to a betrothed woman? A betrothed woman's hand is not considered to be like the hand of her husband." Rava then said there is no difference if she is and then he took the ruling further. And he said there's no difference if she is a betrothed woman and there's no difference if she is a married woman, as her bill of divorce, her get, and her courtyard enter her possession simultaneously. So we can use this mechanism that even though the husband might have rights in a courtyard that she brought into the marriage, or the husband can say, okay, you didn't bring property into the marriage, but you're going to leave the marriage with some property. I'm giving you this piece of land. I'm putting the get in it. All right, and because I'm giving you that piece of land, it becomes fully yours and it acquires the get for you, and now we're divorced. So he can do that. It was taught the Gemara asked, but didn't Rava already say this law, that her get and her courtyard enter her possession simultaneously at the outset of the discussion? And the Gemara answers, when Rava said this law, he said it in connection with this very incident. So you can see how Rava's understanding of the law kind of evolved over the course of this particular incident when he had to make a real-world practical ruling. Now, it was taught in the Mishnah that if a husband throws his wife a get and she is in her house, then she is divorced. Ula says this is only if she is standing next to her house and next to her courtyard. As only then will her house and her courtyard acquire it for her. Rabbi Oshaya says even if she is in Tiberias and her courtyard is in Sippori, or she is in Sippori and her courtyard is in Tiberias, she is divorced. So meaning if she owns property, she doesn't have to be standing right in it or next to it in order for that property to acquire for her. According to one view, according to the other view, no, she has to be present there. What is the law? If one throws a get into his wife's courtyard, the divorce takes effect only if she is standing in her courtyard and the courtyard is consciously secured by her. If she is not standing in her courtyard, even though the get is secured in her courtyard, she is not divorced. And this is in accordance with Ula's statement. And the Gemara challenges this, but isn't it taught in the Mishnah that she is in her house and in her courtyard? And the Gemara answers, this is what the Mishnah is saying. And she is considered to be like one who is in her house, and she is considered to be like one who is in her courtyard. And this means that since it is a courtyard that is secured with her knowledge, it is as though she is there and she is divorced. But as you see, the law didn't end up that way. Now the Gemara suggests, let us say that they disagree about this issue. One sage, Ula, holds that a courtyard is included in the areas where she can obtain ownership of a get as an extension of her hand. Consequently, it has the same law as her hand. So that just as her hand is always close to her, so too her courtyard must be close to her, meaning she is close to her courtyard, in order for the courtyard to acquire the get for her. And the other sage, Rabbi Oshaya, holds that a courtyard is included in the areas where she can obtain ownership of a get as an extension of agency. And therefore, like an agent, her courtyard can acquire the get for her even when she is far away. But the Gemara rejects this. No. This analysis is wrong. No, everyone agrees that a courtyard is included in the areas where she can obtain ownership of a get as an extension of her hand. They disagree about how it is compared to her hand. One sage, Ula, holds that it is entirely like her hand. Just as her actual hand is next to her, so too her courtyard, which is an extension of her hand, acquires the get for her only when it is next to her. I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in. And the other sage, Rabbi Oshaya, holds that if you derive matters in this way, you should say that just as her actual hand is attached to her, so too her courtyard can acquire a get only when it is attached to her, which cannot be. Rather, the comparison is as follows. Her courtyard is like her actual hand, and just as her hand is secured with her knowledge, so too only her courtyard that is consciously secured by her can acquire a get for her. And this serves to exclude her courtyard that is not consciously secured by her, i.e. that she has no control over, which cannot acquire a get for her, since it is not similar to her hand. Bottom line, she may refuse to take the get, but you can place it, in something that is considered her domain with her knowledge. Okay, let's see comments or questions on Gittin 77. Sharon, regarding the beginning and end of Shabbat. And this is why we teach our students that you can do Havdalah up until Wednesday morning. Thank you, Sharon. And Joe, why do the sages not require a respectful transferal of the get? It consistently feels as if there was little respect for women. I can't argue with you. I think what they're talking about here is not the proper way, right? I think the sages were inherently mensches, and they would not say that it's proper to throw the get, I think they're just saying under the letter of the law, they can't make a decree, just for that kind of emotional nicety. And what they're really saying is, okay, under the letter of the law, when is the giving requirement satisfied? Now, I think where that would really become important is if she says, no, I don't take it, I don't accept it, you can't divorce me, I don't accept it. And she just refuses to take it in her hand. Now, it can't be that her refusal to open her hand and receive the get is going to, forever delay the divorce and make it so that they can never become divorced. So they're going to need a mechanism. Now, this idea of throwing, I don't like it either. It sounds terrible. But we also saw it, when we were talking about the law of Shabbos boundaries, and this idea of throwing something into a courtyard, throwing something onto a pedestal, throwing something onto a roof. And I think when they talk about the word throw, it doesn't have that same emotional weight of, there, take it, throwing like in a very nasty way. I think really what they talk about throwing is that something is transferred without going hand to hand. That's the real, legal import of using the word throw. That's my sense of it, I believe. Bill, shalom from Missouri. I would appreciate everyone's prayers. Tomorrow is my very first time preaching to a regular Sunday worship service. I'll be preaching on holy awe. Bill, may you be strengthened to bring your congregation closer to the Holy One above. May you be inspiring and impactful, and I'm confident that you will. All the best, my holy sisters and brothers, and I look forward to learning with you, God willing, tomorrow, Sunday, at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific, for page 78 here in Tractate Gittin. Have a good night and a good week. Good Vach Shavua Tov.